Okay, well, we're going to move on now to our second speaker, who is Anne Menasche. And if you have questions for Sheila, put them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get Sheila back on at the end to talk again a bit more. So Anne Menasche is from the USA. She's a radical feminist, lesbian, socialist, civil rights lawyer, co-founder of Feminists in Struggle and Green Alliance for sex-based rights. She's been on Feminist Question Time before and also is very well known as an activist and feminist, etc. So many of you will know her. Welcome back, Anne. And you're going to talk about being cancelled and how you're fighting back. So thank you so much for speaking to us, and over to you.
I've had a very difficult past 6 months after I was fired in May of 2022. But to know that I have a movement, I'm part of a movement, that I'm not alone, it makes a huge difference. So I was fired for feminism, and what I was trying to do to try to cope with that was to understand it and then to figure out how to fight back. So this is a picture from the Salem witch trials. It's a representation of that. So I've been reading up on Salem. I've been reading up on McCarthyism, to try to understand what happened to me. So May 11th, I was fired without warning after almost 20 years as a civil rights attorney. It came as a surprise even to me. And the reason for my firing was my outside feminist political activity with Feminists in Struggle, including my participation on one of these webinars. For declaring that abortion bans harm women as a sex. And so I was trying to figure out how something like this could happen by a liberal civil rights employer and what exactly was going on. And so what I'm trying to do is inform people about what happened to me, to understand this in context of other periods of American history when witch hunts have occurred, and to help organize a fight back on behalf of myself and the many other women and some men whose jobs and livelihoods are being threatened today simply because they speak out for the sex-based rights of women and girls. And also because my statements were concerned abortion. I also want to talk about how important the right to safe, legal, and accessible abortion is to women, a right that has been stolen recently by the Supreme Court. So what's a witch hunt? I was reading up on different periods in history where people were fired and scapegoated and demonized, and trying to see the commonality. So I put this list together myself. One common theme is the demonization of a group with little power and exaggerating their power and presenting them as extremely dangerous and the epitome of evil. But there's also the factor of a preemptive strike, because I thought, well, women are pretty weak right now, but potentially we could be really strong. And that was true also during the periods of militant trade unionism and a stronger socialist left. There was also the fear that they could become stronger. Misogyny, certainly in the case of the witch hunt against feminism right now, and the pattern of older women as targets, which is really interesting. That was true in the Salem witch trials. Authoritarianism, fear, and intimidation as an attempt to silence opponents, political opponents, scapegoating to divert attention to real causes of problems. The witch hunting is not just an act of one employer or one individual. There's a mass aspect to it. It's a bullying. There has to be some level of mass participation or going along with the witch hunt. Guilt by association. Anyone who defends a witch or associates with a witch is obviously a witch. So everyone wants to, not get near people who've been labeled as such. Punishment for thought crimes. Basically having wrongthink, having ideas that are not accepted, and that of course has a chilling effect on free speech for everyone. Conviction without due process, or on what was called during the Salem witch trials spectral evidence. Spectral evidence being that basically you could your words or just your eyes could attack someone from afar in spirit, and torment the victim. That's the idea of spectral evidence. And I think I was convicted of on the basis of spectral evidence. And then naming names and condemning witches in order to avoid suspicion falling on oneself. So there's been a lot of witch hunts in the history of the United States. These are just a few of the most significant ones. Of course, the Salem witch trials in 1692, 1693. The Red Scare during World War I and into the early 1920s that targeted socialists, the IWW, anarchists, immigrants, union activists, and anti-war protesters. The McCarthy era, which is the most well-known with the Red Scare, loyalty oaths, blacklisting, anti-communist and anti-gay witch hunts that went from the late 1940s into the 50s. Ongoing anti-lesbian witch hunts in the military from the time of the 1950s through about 2010. The no platform, and currently the no platforming of leftists and anti-war journalists from mainstream publications and social media. Chris Hedges would be an example, who was iced from the New York Times for being against the Iraq War. And then, of course, what's going on now with Julian Assange. And then the contemporary turf hunting of gender critical feminists that happened to me and many other women currently. So what is it about the nonprofit world? I have been immersed in the nonprofit legal world for actually more than 20 years. I worked for Legal Aid before working for Disability Rights California. What is it about that that would allow for this to happen? I mean, is there a reason, are there certain milieus and certain jobs that would be ripe for these kind of witch hunts? And I think there are, actually. It seems that women who work in professional settings, lawyers or authors, artists, and university professors, fields where women have made the most gains since the second wave, are the primary targets for modern day anti-feminist witch hunts. Now, the nonprofit legal world is overwhelmingly female, including the attorneys, overwhelmingly female attorneys, and of course the support staff, many women of color. And the main reason for this is that women have significantly less opportunity as lawyers in private practice or in the law firms. Lawyers are found in the government positions and in the nonprofit world primarily. And of course, they're still male dominated. There are some men, and the few men that are there are disproportionately found in upper management and often do have greater opportunities for advancement than the women who work there. I think there's some other characteristics of the nonprofit world, a tendency to micromanagement, which basically limits the opportunities of the women who work there. They are mostly non-union in the United States at will employment, so there's very few rights for staff. And gender ideology and a corporate style diversity, equity, and inclusion have gained a strong foothold as they cost nothing and eliminate the troublesome category of sex, and they keep the staff in their various silos. So how is it that the civil rights organization, which has done really good work, and I'm very proud of the work I've done when I was employed at DRC, how is it that it was so captured by this ideology that a reference to biological sex was interpreted as transphobic hate speech? How did that happen? Now, the organization I work for, DRC, Disability Rights California, is the largest nonprofit legal firm in California, and it has a really good reputation for fighting for people with disabilities. And again, is in many respects typical of the nonprofit legal world that I talked about earlier. Corporate style diversity training started happening. I guess there's always been diversity training, but they've changed. It changed hugely. Much more use of corporate consultants, the same people who advise McDonald's about diversity, have been involved in training the nonprofits, and particularly at least Disability Rights California. And those trainings started started with, trainings that were about sexual harassment and racism and, respecting people's various ethnicities, to this extreme ideological training that told us that sex didn't exist, basically, that it was an invention of, this is almost a direct quote, invention of white colonialism. And so gender or gender identity started being substituted for sex. And so this is just a development that started happening just the last few years, where there was a focus on pronouns. You were urged to list your pronouns on signature lines, and asking any questions or disagreeing with any of this, or declining to declare your pronouns, even though you weren't technically required to do so. Of course, I didn't. Would label you a transphobe. And I was actually labeled a transphobe a few years earlier during a diversity training, because I asked some questions and also said that my lesbianism was sex-based. My orientation was toward women and as a sex, and I was called transphobic for that. So this was starting to build up a few years earlier. So my crime, what was my crime? It's a pretty bizarre story. Right at the time when the Dobbs decision was leaked, and that's the decision that ultimately overturned the right to abortion, the Roe v. Wade decision. It was leaked. The executive director, who's a man, announced on the our all staff email list that our agency had made a public statement in support of Roe v. Wade. They released the statement. It had been released already to the public, released a statement to our staff, and invited comment, explicitly invited comment. The statement mentioned every possible group that might conceivably be impacted by a reversal of Roe, except women. Quote, the reversal would disproportionately negatively impact the most vulnerable populations, including people with disabilities, people of color, people living in poverty, and those without the means of travel. And this was purposeful. Later was clarified that it was purposeful to be, quote unquote, inclusive, i.e. exclude females. So I responded on May 6th. So glad DRC came up with a statement in defense of Roe. Thank you. Access to safe legal abortion is a life and death necessity for women as a biological sex across the board, regardless of race, economic class, gender identity, sexual orientation. Even lesbians can be raped, or anything else, and an absolute prerequisite for equal female participation in society. Of course, the most vulnerable females, especially poor women, women of color, women with disabilities, young girls, unhoused women and girls in prison, etc., will suffer the most under draconian anti-abortion laws. As a veteran of the feminist struggle for abortion rights that preceded Roe, I never thought it would come to this. Thanks again, DRC, for taking a stand. That was a crime. It was a big taboo that I broke. I was immediately reprimanded by a person high in the agency. Quote, many people whose gender is not female can become pregnant, and DRC's all staff email list is no place to circulate statement that try to erase that. And then the full onslaught began. I was called all the names you'd expect. I was a TERF, a hate monger, and my seemingly mild language, a quote unquote dog whistle, that would result in serious violence and stigma against trans people who need abortions. Like in the Salem witch trials, my thoughts and words were supposed to have secret meaning and be so powerful that I could torment my victims from afar. And then the person who started viciously attacking me had already been doing research on me, and had gone online and listened to my videos and included statements I made at Feminist Question Time, which of course were taken out of context to defame me as a hateful and bigoted person. I tried to clarify, I was talking about sex and not gender, and asked that this be discussed off list. And privately, I did receive statements of sympathy and support from several coworkers. So then things moved rapidly. That was Friday. By Monday, there was a meeting behind my back I was not invited to by the group of lawyers and support staff that work on civil rights cases. And that's called the Civil Rights Practice Group, and found me guilty as charged. We disability, this is a quote from the condemnation of me. We, Disability Rights California Civil Rights Group, want to clearly state we support, value, and celebrate our trans colleagues. We reject any actions that would deny or minimize their full identities. The members of this team acknowledge the threat to civil rights presented by the May 6th all-staff correspondence. The opinion expressed by one of our current members does not reflect the Civil Rights Practice Group's values or mission. So I responded pretty strongly after that. I said that this was homophobic and McCarthy-like, and I tried to explain my position as a gender nonconforming or non-femininity performing, I guess would be the way Sheila would maybe say it, lesbian. And also clarified that I supported everyone's rights, but believed it was important to maintain sex and sexual orientation, of course, as a distinct protected class. That was Monday. 2 days later, on May 11th, I was fired by text message while I was sitting in the dentist's office, actually, a text message from management. Subsequently, my employer denied my unemployment benefits on the basis of my alleged misconduct and abuse that threatened the safety of my trans coworkers. So I have decided to fight back, to speak up. I feel like as an older person at the tail end of my career, that I was nowhere near planning to retire, I was in a better position to do so. I do have Social Security, so even though I didn't have unemployment, and I think for a younger woman, it would be more difficult. So I feel like I needed to fight back for myself and also for everyone else who's being threatened and whose jobs and livelihoods are being threatened for being feminists, basically. Witch hunts only end when enough people speak out and say enough is enough. That's what happened during the McCarthy era. A few people said enough is enough. And so that's what has to happen. I have, working with people that I work with in FIST and in the Green Alliance, we formed a committee, the Justice for Me committee, Justice for Ann committee. We are circulating a statement of solidarity that we want to get signatures on, where we will be seeking organizational endorsements shortly. The websites I've listed here on the screen are the websites that you can keep on top of what's going on. I have also hired an attorney, and I do expect to be filing a lawsuit very shortly. So I get inspired by little slogans, and I'm just going to read some of my favorite ones. Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal, do not beg, do not grovel, take courage, join hands, stand beside us, fight with us. That's from Christabel Pankhurst. And then, of course, sisterhood is powerful, which it is. An injury to one is an injury to all, which is a statement from the IWW. And then the statement during the Army McCarthy hearings by Joseph Welch to Senator Joseph McCarthy on June 9th, 1954. Have you no sense of decency? And that's what I say to DRC. Have you no sense of decency? Enough is enough. Yeah, that's me, the witch, the wicked witch of the West here. This is just the beginning of my fight back. And I hope that it helps not only getting justice for myself, but also for all the other women and some men who are being victimized by our contemporary witch hunt against feminism.